create a sense of urgency and desperation. The death ground strategy. You are your own worst enemy. You waste precious time dreaming of the future instead of engaging in the present. Since nothing seems urgent to you, you are only half involved in what you do. The only way to change is through action and outside pressure. Put yourself in situations where you have too much at stake to waste time or resources. If you cannot afford to lose, you won't. Cut your ties to the past. Enter unknown territory where you must depend on your wits and energy to see you through. Place yourself on death ground where your back is against the wall and you have to fight like hell to get out alive. Cortés ran all that aground with the 10 ships. Cuba, to be sure, was still there, in the blue sea, with its farms, its cows, and its tame Indians. But the way to Cuba was no longer through sunny blue waves, rocked in soft idleness, oblivious of danger and endeavor. It was through Motocucuma's court, which had to be conquered by ruse, by force, or by both. Through a sea of warlike Indians who ate their prisoners and donned their skins as trophies. At the stroke of their chief's masterly hand, the 500 men had lost that flow of vital memories and hopes which linked up their souls with their mother island. At one stroke, their backs had been withered and had lost all sense of life. Henceforward, for them, all life was ahead, towards those forbidding peaks which rose gigantically on the horizon, as if to bar all access to what was now not merely their ambition, but their only possible aim. Mexico, mysterious and powerful, behind the conflicting tribes. Hernán Cortés, conqueror of Mexico, Salvador de Madariaga, 1942. The no-return tactic. In 1504, an ambitious 19-year-old Spaniard named Hernán Cortés gave up his studies in law and sailed for his country's colonies in the New World. Stopping first in Santo Domingo, the island today comprising Haiti and the Dominican Republic, then in Cuba, he soon heard about a land to the west called Mexico, an empire teeming with gold and dominated by the Aztecs with their magnificent highland capital of Tenochtitlan. From then on, Cortés had just one thought. Someday, he would conquer and settle the land of Mexico. Over the next 10 years, Cortés slowly rose through the ranks, eventually becoming secretary to the Spanish governor of Cuba and then the king's treasurer for the island. In his own mind, though, he was merely biding his time. He waited patiently while Spain sent other men to Mexico, many of them never to return. Finally, in 1518, the governor of Cuba, Diego de Velázquez, made Cortés the leader of an expedition to discover what had happened to these earlier explorers, find gold, and lay the groundwork for the country's conquest. Velázquez wanted to make that future conquest himself, however, so for this expedition, he wanted a man he could control, and he soon developed doubts about Cortés. The man was clever, perhaps too much so. Word reached Cortés that the governor was having second thoughts about sending him to Mexico. Deciding to give Velázquez no time to nurse his misgivings, he managed to slip out of Cuba in the middle of the night with 11 ships. He would explain himself to the governor later. Meditation on inevitable death should be performed daily. Every day, when one's body and mind are at peace, one should meditate upon being ripped apart by arrows, rifles, spears, and swords, being carried away by surging waves, being thrown into a great fire, being struck by lightning, being shaken to death by a great earthquake, falling from 1,000-foot cliffs, dying of disease, or committing seppuku at the death of one's master, and every day, without fail, one should consider himself as dead. Hagakure, The Book of the Samurai, Yamamoto Tsunetomo, 1659 to 1720. Cortés sensed that this was the decisive moment of the expedition. He could easily squash the conspiracy, but there would be others. His men were a rough lot, and their minds were on gold, Cuba, their families, anything but fighting the Aztecs. He could not conquer an empire with men so divided and untrustworthy, but how to fill them with the energy and focus for the immense task he faced. Thinking this through, he decided to take swift action. He seized the conspirators and had the two ringleaders hanged. Next, he bribed his pilots to bore holes in all of the ships and then announced that worms had eaten through the boards of the vessels, making them unseaworthy. Pretending to be upset at the news, Cortés ordered what was salvageable from the ships to be taken ashore and then the holes to be sunk. The pilots complied, but not enough holes had been bored, and only 5 of the ships went down. The story of the worms was plausible enough, and the soldiers accepted the news of the 5 ships with equanimity. But when a few days later more ships were run aground and only 1 was left afloat, it was clear to them that Cortés had arranged the whole thing. When he called a meeting, their mood was mutinous and murderous. This was no time for subtlety. Cortés addressed his men. He was responsible for the disaster, he admitted. He had ordered it done, but now there was no turning back. They could hang him, but they were surrounded by hostile Indians and had no ships. Divided and leaderless, they would perish. The only alternative was to follow him to Tenochtitlan. Only by conquering the Aztecs, by becoming lords of Mexico, could they get back to Cuba alive. To reach Tenochtitlan, they would have to fight with utter intensity. They would have to be unified. Any dissension would lead to defeat and a terrible death. The situation was desperate, but if the men fought desperately in turn, Cortés guaranteed that he would lead them to victory. Since the army was so small in number, the glory and riches would be all the greater. Any cowards not up to the challenge could sail the one remaining ship home. There is something in war that drives so deeply into you that death ceases to be the enemy, merely another participant in a game you don't wish to end. Phantom over Vietnam, John Trotty, USMC, 1984. No one accepted the offer, and the last ship was run aground. Over the next months, Cortés kept his army away from Veracruz and the coast. Their attention was focused on Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec Empire. The grumbling, the self-interest, and the greed all disappeared. Understanding the danger of their situation, the conquistadors fought ruthlessly. Some 2 years after the destruction of the Spanish ships, and with the help of their Indian allies, Cortés's army laid siege to Tenochtitlan and conquered the Aztec Empire. "You don't have time for this display, you fool," he said in a severe tone. "This, whatever you are doing now, may be your last act on earth. It may very well be your last battle. There is no power which could guarantee that you are going to live 1 more minute. Acts have power," he said, "especially when the person acting knows that those acts are his last battle. There is a strange consuming happiness in acting with the full knowledge that whatever one is doing may very well be one's last act on earth. I recommend you reconsider your life and bring your acts into that light. Focus your attention on the link between you and your death. Without remorse or sadness or worrying, focus your attention on the fact you don't have time and let your acts flow accordingly. Let each of your acts be your last battle on earth. Only under those conditions will your acts have their rightful power. Otherwise, they will be, for as long as you live, the acts of a timid man." Is it so terrible to be a timid man? No. It isn't, if you are going to be immortal, but if you are going to die, there is not time for timidity, simply because timidity clings to something that exists only in your thoughts. It soothes you while everything is at a lull, but then the awesome, mysterious world will open its mouth for you as it will for every one of us, and then you will realize that your sure ways were not sure at all. Being timid prevents us from examining and exploiting our lot as men. Journey to Ixtlan, The Lessons of Don Juan, Carlos Castaneda, 1972. Interpretation. On the night of the conspiracy, Cortés had to think fast. What was the root of the problem he faced? It was not the Velázquez spies, or the hostile Aztecs, or the incredible odds against him. The root of the problem was his own men and the ships in the harbor. His soldiers were divided in heart and mind. They were thinking about the wrong things, their wives, their dreams of gold, their plans for the future. And in the backs of their minds there was always an escape route. If this conquest business went badly, they could go home. Those ships in the harbor were more than just transportation. They represented Cuba, the freedom to leave, the ability to send for reinforcements, so many possibilities. For the soldiers, the ships were a crutch, something to fall back on if things got ugly. Once Cortés had identified the problem, the solution was simple: destroy the ships. By putting his men in a desperate place, he would make them fight with utmost intensity. A sense of urgency comes from a powerful connection to the present. Instead of dreaming of rescue or hoping for a better future, you have to face the issue at hand. Fail and you perish. People who involve themselves completely in the immediate problem are intimidating. Because they are focusing so intensely, they seem more powerful than they are. Their sense of urgency multiplies their strength and gives them momentum. Instead of 500 men, Cortés suddenly had the weight of a much larger army at his back. Like Cortés, you must locate the root of your problem. It is not the people around you. It is yourself and the spirit with which you face the world. In the back of your mind, you keep an escape route, a crutch, something to turn to if things go bad. Maybe it's some wealthy relative you can count on to buy your way out. Maybe it's some grand opportunity on the horizon, the endless vistas of time that seem to be before you. Maybe it's a familiar job or comfortable relationship that is always there if you fail. Just as Cortés's men saw their ships as insurance, you may see this fallback as a blessing, but in fact, it's a curse. It divides you. Because you think you have options, you never involve yourself deeply enough in one thing to do it thoroughly, and you never quite get what you want. Sometimes you need to run your ships aground, burn them, and leave yourself just one option: succeed or go down. Make the burning of your ships as real as possible. Get rid of your safety net. Sometimes you have to become a little desperate to get anywhere. The ancient commanders of armies, who well knew the powerful influence of necessity and how it inspired the soldiers with the most desperate courage, neglected nothing to subject their men to such a pressure. Niccolo Machiavelli, 1469 to 1527. The death at your heels tactic. In 1845, the writer Fyodor Dostoevsky, then 25, shook the Russian literary world with the publication of his first novel, Pourfold. He became the toast of St. Petersburg society. But something about his early fame seemed empty to him. He drifted into the fringes of left-wing politics, attending meetings of various socialist and radical groups. One of these groups centered on the charismatic Mikhail Petrashevsky. 2 years later, in 1848, revolution broke out all over Europe. Inspired by what was happening in the West, Russian radical groups like Petrashevsky's talked of following suit. But agents of Tsar Nicholas I had infiltrated many of these groups, and reports were written about the wild things being discussed at Petrashevsky's house, including talk of inciting peasant revolts. Dostoevsky was fervent about freeing the serfs, and on April 23, 1849, he and 23 other members of the Petrashevsky group were arrested. After 8 months of languishing in jail, the prisoners were awakened one cold morning and told that today they would finally hear their sentences. A few months' exile was usually the punishment for their crime. Soon, they thought, their ordeal would be over. They were bundled into carriages and driven through the icy streets of St. Petersburg. Emerging from the carriages into Semyonovska Square, they were greeted by a priest. Behind him they could see rows of soldiers, and behind the soldiers, thousands of spectators. They were led toward a scaffold covered in black cloth at the center of the square. In front of the scaffold were 3 posts, and to the side was a line of carts laden with coffins. Dostoevsky could not believe what he saw. "It's not possible that they mean to execute us," he whispered to his neighbor. They were marched to the scaffold and placed in 2 lines. It was an unbelievably cold day, and the prisoners were wearing the light clothes they'd been arrested in back in April. A drum roll sounded. An officer came forward to read their sentences. "All of the accused are guilty as charged of intending to overthrow the national order and are therefore condemned to death before a firing squad." The prisoners were too stunned to speak. As the officer read out the individual charges and sentences, Dostoevsky found himself staring at the golden spire of a nearby church and at the sunlight. The gleams of light disappeared as a cloud passed overhead, and the thought occurred to him that he was about to pass into darkness just as quickly and forever. Suddenly he had another thought. If I do not die, if I am not killed, my life will suddenly seem endless, a whole eternity, each minute a century. I will take account of everything that passes. I will not waste a second of life again. The prisoners were given hooded shirts. The priest came forward to read them their last rites and hear their confessions. They said goodbye to one another. The first 3 to be shot were tied to the posts, and the hoods were pulled over their faces. Dostoevsky stood in the front, in the next group to go. The soldiers raised their rifles, took aim, and suddenly a carriage came galloping into the square. A man got out with an envelope. At the last second, the Tsar had commuted their death sentences. It had long been known, of course, that a man who, through disciplined training, had relinquished any desire or hope for survival, and had only one goal, the destruction of his enemy, could be a redoubtable opponent and a truly formidable fighter who neither asked nor offered any quarter once his weapon had been unsheathed. In this way, a seemingly ordinary man who, by the force of circumstances rather than by profession, had been placed in the position of having to make a desperate choice, could prove dangerous, even to a skilled fencing master. One famous episode, for example, concerns a teacher of swordsmanship who was asked by a superior to surrender a servant guilty of an offense punishable by death. This teacher, wishing to test a theory of his concerning the power of that condition we would call desperation, challenged the doomed man to a duel. Knowing full well the irrevocability of his sentence, the servant was beyond caring one way or the other, and the ensuing duel proved that even a skilled fencer and teacher of the art could find himself in great difficulty when confronted by a man who, because of his acceptance of imminent death, could go to the limit and even beyond in his strategy without a single hesitation or distracting consideration. The servant, in fact, fought like a man possessed, forcing his master to retreat until his back was almost to the wall. At last, the teacher had to cut him down in a final effort wherein the master's own desperation brought about the fullest coordination of his courage, skill, and determination. Secrets of the Samurai, Oscar Ratty and Adele Westbrook, 1973. Hard labor in Siberia, to be followed by a stint in the army. Barely affected, he wrote that day to his brother, "When I look back at the past and think of all the time I squandered in error and idleness, then my heart bleeds. Life is a gift. Every minute could have been an eternity of happiness. If only youth knew. Now my life will change. Now I will be reborn." A few days later, 10-pound shackles were put on Dostoevsky's arms and legs. They would stay there for the length of his prison term, and he was carted off to Siberia. For the next 4 years, he endured the most abysmal prison conditions, granted no writing privileges. He wrote novels in his head, memorized them. Finally, in 1857, still serving the army period of his sentence, he was allowed to start publishing his work. Where before he would torture himself over a page, spend half a day idling it away in thought, now he wrote and wrote. Friends would see him walking the streets of St. Petersburg, mumbling bits of dialogue to himself, lost in his characters and plots. His new motto was, tried to get as much done as possible in the shortest time. Some pitied Dostoevsky his time in prison. That made him angry. He was grateful for the experience and felt no bitterness. But for that December day in 1849, he felt he would have wasted his life. Right up until his death in 1881, he continued writing at a frantic pace, churning out novel after novel, Crime and Punishment, The Possessed, The Brothers Karamazov, as if each one were his last. Interpretation. Tsar Nicholas had decided to sentence the Petrushevsky radicals to hard labor soon after their arrest, but he wanted to teach them a harsher lesson as well. So he dreamed up the cruel theater of the death sentence with its careful details, the priest, the hoods, the coffins, the last-second pardon. This, he thought, would really humble and humiliate them. In fact, some of the prisoners were driven insane by the events of that day. But the effect on Dostoevsky was different. He had been afflicted for years with a sense of wandering, of feeling lost, of not knowing what to do with his time. An extremely sensitive man, that day he literally felt his own death deep in his bones, and he experienced his pardon as a rebirth. The effect was permanent. For the rest of his life, Dostoevsky would consciously bring himself back to that day, remembering his pledge never to waste another moment. Or, if he felt he had grown too comfortable and complacent, he would go to a casino and gamble away all his money. Poverty and debt were for him a kind of symbolic death, throwing him back on the possible nothingness of his life. In either case, he would have to write, and not the way other novelists wrote, as if it were a pleasant little artistic career, with its attendant delights of salons, lectures, and other frills. Dostoevsky wrote as if his life were at stake, with an intense feeling of urgency and seriousness. Death is impossible for us to fathom. It is so immense, so frightening, that we will do almost anything to avoid thinking about it. Society is organized to make death invisible, to keep it several steps removed. That distance may seem necessary for our comfort, but it comes with a terrible price: the illusion of limitless time and a consequent lack of seriousness about daily life. We are running away from the one reality that faces us all. As a warrior in life, you must turn this dynamic around. Make the thought of death something not to escape, but to embrace. Your days are numbered. Will you pass them half awake and half-hearted, or will you live with a sense of urgency? Cruel theaters staged by a czar are unnecessary. Death will come to you without them. Imagine it pressing in on you, leaving you no escape, for there is no escape. Feeling death at your heels will make all your actions more certain, more forceful. This could be your last throw of the dice. Make it count. While knowing that we will die someday, we think that all the others will die before us and that we will be the last to go. Death seems a long way off. Is this not shallow thinking? It is worthless and is only a joke within a dream. Insofar as death is always at one's door, one should make sufficient effort and act quickly. Hagakure, The Book of the Samurai, Yamamoto Tsunekomo, 1659-1720.